Right, welcome everyone. My name is Matt Hardy. I'm the Program Director for Planning and Performance Management here at AASHTO. And to all of you joining us on the line today, welcome to a special Thursday edition of the 2021 TAM Guide Book Club series. This is our 5th book club meeting, and our topic today is on improving risk management and resilience. We have several more of these book club webinars in this series still on the calendar. Our next book club meeting, number 6, will be in just under a week on Wednesday, June 2nd at 2 p.m. Eastern Time with a topic on increasing your workforce capacity. The following webinar will take place on Wednesday, June 9th, and the topic will be investing strategies and multi-objective decision analysis. So that we hope you can join us for those. And if you want to register, you can go to for these TAM webinars or catch up on past webinars from nearly 10 years ago, I have realized. You can go to the TAM portal, tam-portal.com. Click on TAM webinars under events in the main menu. So you can register there for all the upcoming book club meetings and for future TAM webinars as well. And you can also use the TAM website to access the TPM portal and sign up for our bi-monthly TPM webinars as well. I want to do that sort of cross-sharing of ideas and everything between TAM and TPM. Again, you'll find archives there. And if you want the slides and everything from today's webinar, they'll be posted there along with a recording of the content of this first portion of the webinar. And then you'll also find the winner of last webinar's quest, group 5. That was from 2 weeks ago, so congratulations to group 5. Now I'll make one more plug for the TAM guide. It's available, that we're going over today. It's available at tamguide.com as well as from the AASHTO bookstore. So if you, as a reminder, if you're from a state DOT, you have 10 free copies of the PDF version, sort of the printable version of the TAM guide. You can also access it at tamguide.com. Same information. Finally, if you have questions at all during today's webinar, please use the webinar's chat feature, Zoom chat functionality. We'll have time for open discussion towards the end of the session today. And now I'm going to turn it over to Steve Gay. Wait, Steve is not with us, unfortunately, so I'm gonna do my best impression of my good friend Steve, who works at FHWA and FHWA is one of the co-sponsors of this webinar. So thanks, Matt. FHWA is a proud sponsor of this special TAM book club series and the TAM webinar series in cooperation with AASHTO. At our last meeting, we had some great presentations and discussion on the topic of TAM financial planning. And I'm excited about this week to dive right into today's topic, managing risk and resilience. As you know, risk management is fundamental to asset management and is a critical element of your risk-based asset management plans. In many of the initial TAMPs, agencies were early in their understanding of risk management in the context of asset management. This session will help introduce you to the valuable material in the AASHTO TAM guide that can help advance your agency's risk management practice. The agency's next TAMPs, due in 2022, various times throughout 2022, will provide an opportunity to show the progress that so many of you have made in this area in recent years. On our agenda today, we'll hear from 2 guest speakers who will share their perspectives on risk management and resilience at their agencies. I'm looking forward to hearing from many of you on the line who are using the TAM guide to support your strong asset management practices. We hope that this interactive book club format and the breakout groups that we're trying to do will really help all of us joining today to learn from one another, as well as dig deeper into the TAM guide and its understanding and the content and how to access the information. I think you're going to enjoy today's session, and I hope we'll learn a lot this afternoon. And finally, as Matt, me mentioned, the topic of next week's book club is increasing workforce capacity. I really hope that you will join us again on Wednesday next week, June 2nd, and join us. And now I'll turn it over to Brad Allen of Applied Pavement Technology, who's going to lead us through our agenda and objectives for today. So Brad, all yours.
Thanks, Matt. So welcome everybody to the 5th book club meeting for the TAM guide. Today, we've gone through the introductions of Matt Hardy and Steve Gay. I'm Brad Allen from Applied Pavement Technology, and I'll be facilitating the rest of the discussion today. We will start out with some Menti questions to get a sense of folks' understanding and the maturity of risk management in your agencies. And then I'll provide a brief overview of risk management, very brief, as this is a very complex topic and actually has its whole entire own AASHTO guide to enterprise risk management, in addition to the TAM guide. We'll hear from two state use cases, as Matt mentioned. So William Johnson from Colorado DOT and Todd Lamphere from Washington State DOT will provide some insights into how their agencies are addressing risk and resiliency, as Todd will focus on his state's efforts regarding resiliency. And then we have a quest for you today. We'll have breakouts and everybody will be working on the same quest today. And it's a challenging one and directly relates to risk management. So I think it'll be a lot of fun. We'll come back from that and hear how the groups did, get some feedback, and then we'll have some time for open discussions. So without further ado, I think let's introduce the topic through the Menti polls, Perry, and see how folks' agencies, how you feel about your agency and your efforts so far related to risk and resiliency. So first off, to what extent do you agree with the following statement? My agency's risk management process influences investment decisions such as project selection. All right, this is a fun one as we start to see two camps forming in these responses. All right, so we see a pretty broad spread of maturity or how much risk is really impacting investment decisions across agencies. So let's go ahead and jump to our next question. I think folks will still have the ability to continue answering that one. So multiple choice, oops, I guess we lost the question. In any case, the question is, my agency has developed programmatic approaches to improve resiliency from the following threats. So if your agency has addressed in a programmatic way the resiliency related to these threats, please select all that are applicable. And if you have something else, a major threat that your agency is addressing, please enter that in the chat. We'd be curious to see what are the threats that folks have come up with agency-wide resiliency efforts related to. All right. So lots of folks, seismic, unstable slopes, rock falls. And we've got some others coming in the chat, so we can check that out. All right, looks like those answers are stabilizing. Let's take a quick, we got a couple more questions here. So here, our third question, my agency has established a standing team to address risk management and or resiliency issues. So does your agency have a risk management team, a resiliency team, both or neither? This, I would guess this may be somewhat similar to the even spread we saw in question one. I'm curious. Although right now, neither leads the charge. A few more answers coming in. Yeah, so more than half do not have a standing team or unit to address these issues. Interesting. We'll hear a little bit more about that from our case studies. All right, let's move to our last question.
So maybe I'm not.
What is your main concern or biggest question regarding risks as you prepare to develop your next TAMP? And this is just fill in the blank. Whatever you feel is your biggest concern, your main challenge. What's something you're not clear about that you feel you really need to get to the bottom of for your next TAMP for your agency? Quantifying. I think we'll hear a little bit about that. All right. FHWA expectations, always good to know those. Assessing uncertainty, right? That's what we'll be talking about. Keeping the all hazards enterprise risk management up to date. Great. Linking risk to performance measures or not being able to. And connecting them to decisions. Great. There we go, starting to scroll. The administrative burden of, tracking your risks. What kind of resources do you have to put towards that? So great questions. I think this will be a really useful resource for AASHTO and FHWA after today. All right, I think that looks like it's stabilized some. I think folks can still, if you go to menti.com, use that code 36, whatever it was, it's disappeared, sorry, 36120568. You can continue to put answers, particularly to that last one. I think that'll be helpful, and we can pass that along to folks. All right, so let's we'll provide a little bit of an overview of risk management, grabbing some material from the asset management guide. So this is not an in-depth review, as we just want to go through this quickly so we can get to our case studies. So when we're talking about risks, we're talking about the positive or negative effects of uncertainty or variability upon an agency, right? So risk is really about uncertainty, or the fact that sometimes we know what's going to happen, but the results may be somewhat variable, and those variations can have an impact on our ability to achieve objectives. And that's a definition from the federal regulation for asset management plans. So risk management then is the process and framework for managing potential risks, including identifying, analyzing, evaluating, and addressing the risks to asset and system performance. So that gets to our objectives, and we'll talk a little bit. We all kind of know what these major risks are, right? We've got seismic risks, weather-related risks, climate-related risks, staffing risks, funding risks. How do we really dive into the details and figure out how do we quantify that? How do we analyze that information? And how do we base decisions on that analysis? So next slide, Perry. So the risk management process that it's based on ISO has a similar process, and you'll see this process in FHWA guidance, and it's represented in the guide as well. This is a graphic out of the guide, and you see here these 5 major steps that are then connected through continual communication and consultation. So The first step of setting the context is all about which risks are you going to consider, right? You want to set boundaries a bit around this, because there are when the area of risk is so broad, you need to set that context, so everybody knows when you come into the process what you'll be addressing. But it's also about establishing the rules related to how you're going to perform the other steps in the process. So as you move to risk identification, once you've set that context, be inclusive within the bounds of that context, and try to think broadly through all the potential areas of uncertainty and variability that could impact your asset management program or your assets themselves. And then the analysis step is where you look at, okay, if these are the potential events or these are the areas of uncertainty that we want to address, you need to look at the potential causes, consequences, and likelihood of those risks. So what may trigger this risk to happen or variability to occur? If it happens, then what are the consequences? What might the impact be to your agency, to your program? And what's the likelihood that those impacts may occur? And of course, you might have different scenarios for each risk event. And then the evaluation process uses all the information you've gathered in the prior two steps to prioritize your risk. And this is where quantification can be helpful. And we'll talk about that in a minute. And then once you've identified your risks, you've prioritized your risks, then you need to develop mitigation strategies to figure out how you want to address those risks. And this gets to setting a risk tolerance and understanding that there are some risks that you are simply going to say, we will accept that risk and deal with the consequences if they occur. And other risks, you need to establish proactive mitigation strategies to address, to either prevent, reduce the likelihood, or better prepare for the occurrence of that risk happening. Next slide, Perry. So let's talk a little bit about that likelihood and consequence. So this is another example from the guide, hint, hint, it may come in handy later, where a state established these qualitative terms for likelihood and consequence that describe something that could be very likely, to have a very high likelihood, or very unlikely. And you can see some how they described that in the columns here, as well as the rows, or each row here represents a likelihood, different level of likelihood. Each column represents a different level of impact, from very low impact to very high impact or catastrophic impact. To help quantify this, you can establish scores for each of these by applying some numerical rating to very low, very high impact. These are example scores that I've added in, and that's something, as we get into our breakouts, you'll have an opportunity to determine, how might your agency approach this? Are there some examples in the guide that can help with that? All right, next slide. So here's an example risk register. This actually isn't in the guide, but I think it's a very good example of a risk register from Hawaii DOT, where they've laid all of this out very clearly, so you can see what the priority of the risk is over to the left, the description of the risk in the risk item, the cause of each risk, the expected effect of each risk. They've categorized them as threats or opportunities, right? Threats are potential negative impacts. Opportunities are potential positive impacts. And then they walk through their assessment of the probability and impact, and they show how that is represented on their risk matrix. And then you can see their suggested responses and response actions to each risk. And we'll talk about it a little bit later, but our breakout session example will be based on this risk register, so you'll each have a chance to see it. All right, well, next slide. I want to keep us moving. So just a little bit on resiliency. And this is a topic that's really advancing quickly, and there hasn't been a lot that tightly ties resiliency to asset management through the guidance yet. So this is information you can see the links at the bottom. So this is from FHWA, and this is their vulnerability assessment and adaptation framework. And there is an example in the guide where a state used this framework, which is typically project-based, to apply this approach to be more programmatic and develop a pavement program that would allow them to have more resilient pavements across the state rather than looking project by project. So resilience is defined as the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties, and that's the dictionary definition. You can see some synonyms there: toughness, hardiness, strength, durability, adaptability. That's what we're talking about with resilience. How can we engineer, design, manage our assets so that they will be more resilient to these threats that we've identified through risk management? So, and see, next slide. Yeah, so we'll hear from two speakers today on these topics. William Johnson from Colorado DOT is the Performance and Asset Management Branch Manager. William will talk about Colorado DOT's approach to risk management. And then we'll hear from Todd Lamphere from Washington State DOT. Todd's the statewide Transportation Asset Management Program Manager. And Todd will talk about Washington State DOT's efforts to get a resilience team established and helping the agency coordinate an effort to harden their assets and make sure that their program and assets are more resilient. So with that, I will turn things over to William.
I'm actually going to defer to Todd first.
Oh, okay.
He's got some risk management on zombie deer issues that he has to attend to.
Great. All right. So Todd, let's let's go to you.
Thank you. You missed out on an important conversation in the pre-meeting there.
Oh, sorry.
That's all right. I appreciate the flexibility here. So I'm going to click share, and Brad, can you tell me if you see that?
Yes.
Perfect. So first off, I think thank you for the discussion and the intro. It would be really interesting to see those questions that if we asked those on the initial journey as we started asset management with risk, seeing us slightly below average on that question. I think it was 2 or 2.1, and then maybe in just a couple of years, that would be pretty interesting. But moving over to what I'd like to give you for the next 5 or so minutes is just kind of a journey we're beginning here in Washington State DOT to better connect or integrate resiliency. And we don't have this figured out. We're not claiming victory. This is the beginning of yet another journey for us. I think in the chat, I didn't add it in there. I added one thing we're looking at amidst everything else that was said is cybersecurity, but also human resources or personnel in light of the pandemic recently is something that they're talking about and how do we get better at. So I wanted to just go over our structure in Washington for asset management. We're a little bit different and unique. We took a little larger scale approach in Washington where we began to document asset management approaches for all classes, if you will, and you'll see those there. Things from what's federally required for pavement and bridge, including, then we also have plans for ferry terminals and vessels. You see what we have there for intra-agency, as well as multimodal, including aviation, public transportation, and rail. When we did submit to FHWA only what was required for pavement and bridge, but we documented on the rest so that we could meet the federal requirement, but yet use the information for internal purposes here. So I bring this slide up because one of our approach to asset management and connecting to resiliency has done several things, but one thing it's helped us communicate is our funding need. And this is particularly important when you're looking at how to look at risk, how to look at resiliency and the trade-off connections, and I'll cover that in just a moment. This is the third time we've updated these numbers. We started at about 50% unfunded, funded or unfunded, and then we went to 43% funded, and now we're at 39% funded or 61% unfunded. So yes, the opposite of where we should be heading. This has been really important to communicate to our decision makers, heading in the wrong direction, but it also makes those trade-off connections and decisions much more difficult as we see this progressing down the wrong path. And like you can see, this information has given us data and a little bit more precise ability to talk about what our needs are for maintenance and preservation. That's why your plans are key, and how it leads into trade-offs for resiliency and for risk. So some of the structures here, we've got an executive steering committee structure for each of those 4 groups. The technical advisory groups meet monthly or as needed. And as I said, we've updated those numbers 3 or 4 times and with unfunded needs. And for the risk perspective, several formal workshops were held, but most have done self-assessments on risk. And asset management plans in any future updates, and that's where we're shifting into resiliency for this discussion, should include practices that involve what their class resiliency effort is. And I'll talk about that just for a moment here. We're not asking for anything significant. It's actually just a section where we've provided some questions in the risk chapter. And it's just a section that asks, what are you doing? Because it varies when you have 21 plans, it varies. Ferry terminals need to be concerned with things like seismic vulnerability, seawater rise. Ferry vessels needs to be concerned with tsunami. I didn't think about that initially, and in meeting with that program director, they have a plan with the Coast Guard to think about tsunami. Our TEF equipment, the maintenance equipment, has to be positioned in such a way that should something catastrophic occur up along the I-5 corridor or east-west on the I-90 corridor, they're able to respond. Buildings where our employees work have to meet certain facility seismic codes. And what we're seeing now is the introduction into in things that go beyond the traditional things we've thought about, being seismic vulnerability, wildland fires, and tsunami and seawater rise. Things like cyber security, just in the news about the pipeline that brings things to light. I am learning internally, we have some things that we have to consider from an operational perspective on our ferry boats, on our trains, as well as in our traffic management systems. So things that need to be considered. And I think we all know about the recent pandemic and how we have to look at resiliency for our employees. As we kind of transition to this, oddly enough, a year ago in March, we were planning an exercise to test the ability of our employees to telework, the entire agency to telework in one day. And well, we did the exercise, but we did it for real. And it worked well. We had some bumps like most of you, but we fixed that. So how do we define resiliency? This was important. Brad mentioned it's important to define it, or else it's everything, right? So we took our definition from the Presidential Policy Directive in 2013 here, and it just means to us, resiliency means the ability to prepare for, adapt to changing conditions, and withstand and recover rapidly from disruptions. One thing I'll tell you in the small journey we've begun, that you do have to put bookends, or else everybody will change their language slightly so that everything means resiliency. So you have to really kind of understand what is and what is not resiliency. This here is, there's some federal regulations related to resiliency and asset management. So federal 23 CFR 515 talks about risk-based asset management plans that must address risks associated with current and future environmental conditions. Part 667 says that, and most of us in asset management know this, repeated failures as a result of some kind of a natural event. Then some probably less common to the asset management community, USC 134, 23 USC 134 and 23 CFR 450, state and metropolitan planning organizations have to include this in their plans, and they also should include an assessment of their investments to deal with these. There's some data out there, risk and resiliency, or resiliency and asset management. This is one of the reports that was published in 2013 that has some really good information here. I didn't have time to update this slide, but recently, within the last few weeks, I think it was TRB released a resiliency guidebook. My memory serves me right, it's about 500 pages, or maybe it's a lot of pages. Really good information though, really good. I've read about half of it, but I was involved in kind of the development of that. So really good, that would complement this March 2013 document. And then when we update our plans here in Washington, we want to, like I said, add a specific section. And I want to really talk about this directions would be provided by our office in this guidance, and it'll be an initial step. But I want to pause here and talk about this structure. In Washington State, we have a group called the Resiliency Work Group. This group includes representation from most, if not every, section of the department. We meet quarterly for a couple hours to talk about resiliency, what is going on, and what should be going on in those particular areas. There are currently 3 subgroups with a 4th that might be forming. Those are seismic is the first subgroup, climate change is the second subgroup, and cybersecurity is the third subgroup. And the 4th that is there's discussion about is the human resources subgroup. And these folks work on a lot of details specific to their areas. There's a leadership team of about 4, myself in asset management, the agency's emergency manager is on there, a representative from environmental, and a representative from communications are on the leadership team. And this group has been very instrumental in what they do in resiliency, and asset management has been instrumental in just pushing asset management forward. And it was about a year ago that we finally connected the two. And the charter for the Resiliency Work Group now structures them to report to the Asset Management Executive Steering Committee. So that was a pretty good change in how we do business. And we're learning a lot. There's a work plan that is developed that we're pushing forward in that particular area. And it's helpful. Again, like most things, people want it to move faster. But there's no one in our agency that has this as their full-time job. This is kind of a side job for all of us to be able to bring this effort forward. And what you'll see there on the bottom is our goal is to start small and then continuously improve versus start really big and get kind of fall under the weight of the effort. The other thing that's really important, and Stephen Gay's not here on this call. My understanding is that resiliency also may be featured in a future federal legislation or infrastructure package. There's been a lot of talk about this at the federal level, so it's not sure where it may head. But when you read the documents, there's a lot of direction about where and how to consider resiliency. And it really does follow and structure what Part 667 does and is talking about. Then the last part that I want to say is this can't just fall on asset management or within the resiliency effort. This is really important to involve all levels. For example, planning, project level, as well as operations and maintenance. I took this graphic, it's actually a slide from an FHWA presentation, because I think it really speaks volumes. If you try to address resiliency only at the operations and maintenance level, you're reactive. You might solve that particular effort, but not the systemic problems. And then when you try to prevent that, when operations and maintenance gives input at the project level, you might get a little bit further ahead, but not too far. And I think really what happens is a lot of this has to occur at the long range planning level. Some of this can occur through the asset management plans, but it really has to permeate the transportation long range plans, all of them. In Washington, it's our overarching umbrella plan as well as the modal plans. And at least what the studies are saying is that the more you can plan for these events, the better that you are positioned to deal with the events versus dealing with them at the project or the operations and maintenance level. So that's what we're trying to do with this work group in Washington State. Like I said, we have a charter. We meet quarterly. We do have an agency executive that oversees this, the deputy secretary does, and it's connected to asset management at the executive steering committee level. And it's been very helpful thus far. They're an active participant and a person that provides information for asset management. I think that's my last slide. And Brad, I don't know if we're taking questions or we're jumping right into the next, to William's presentation.
Thanks, Todd. I think given the time, we're going to move right into William's presentation. So
perfect.
Thank you very much. And William, whenever you're ready, take it away. Do you have your own slides?
I need Todd to stop sharing first.
I'm working on that.
Come on, Todd.
Stop share. There you go. It should be all yours, William.
All right, cool. Appreciate that. I'm going to be sharing in a weird way just so I'm able to manipulate the slides some. And if you bear with me 1 second, I was trying to post something in the chat, but of course, being the way technology is, it's lost. Oh, here it is. Apologies for that. What I'm posting in the chat is links to CDOT's approach to risk and resilience analysis. And in that, what you'll find is a pretty short read of about 303 pages of information about how you could go about performing a similar type of risk analysis that CDOT has. What you see here is a picture of flooding. I think for most people, this is a creek. For Colorado, this is a river. This is an actual flooding in Colorado that occurred in 2013, which was more or less a catalyst for much of our learning and knowledge on risk and resilience. And we refer to this roughly as a cookbook. It's a detailed approach for how to go about calculating risk. And we did it for 3 of our most common threats: flood, geohazard / rockfall, and fire debris flow. It seems like any given year, half the state is on fire for about 6 months out of the year. Again, the links are in the box. There's also a link to an Excel tool. I know, an Excel tool, but really when it comes to use of non-proprietary software, really can't beat Excel. And what you'll find in that Excel tool is a lot of what I'm going to be referring to or showing you today is included within that Excel tool. Don't worry, when you open up the Excel tool, you're going to be like, oh my God, what is this? The guide, that 303-page guide, really covers the details about how you use it. Now, what's not covered within that Excel tool is really this concept of criticality. Everybody has a different definition of criticality, but it's important to understand criticality in terms of how your organization views it, because it really sets the context for what you're going to apply a risk analysis on. And I remember 2 years ago, I was talking to somebody from Illinois DOT. They had tried to go through and quantify or capture all the risk that they face throughout their DOT. And they said, you know what? This is sort of a pointless task. We're never going to get to a point where we stop trying to figure out what our risks are and get to a point where we're actually managing risk. One way to do that is to prioritize. And that's essentially what criticality does for you. It gives you the ability to prioritize that corridor, those roadways, those assets that you're going to have the most vulnerability on. Now, with our approach to criticality, I just want to point out a couple of things. One of them is that Colorado is a heavy tourism state, as well as we have one primary east-west interstate, which carries the majority of the freight across the Continental Divide in Colorado. So we definitely wanted to account for that. But there's also this weird thing called SOVI. SOVI is the social volatility, if I could pronounce it right, the social volatility index. In that, it's roughly what it says here. It's a measurement of vulnerability for communities. And when we look at criticality, you're not just looking at, oh, does your asset have a vulnerability? It's really, if the asset fails, what is the impact to your community? Can emergency responders reach that community through your transportation system? Are they cut off from hospitals and schools and government/public offices that they will need in an emergency? Critical to understanding that was, of course, the use of GIS to really capture those factors that we use to calculate that criticality in a way that one has an elegant user interface, but also GIS is a really quick tool for doing math on some of these things. Now, reducing 303 pages in 6 easy steps. And we're going to cover just examples from these steps. Step 1 is your threat data collection. 2 is your asset data collection. 3 is your owner consequence calculation. 4 would be your user consequence calculation. That separation between when there is an event. There's a difference between what the owner is experiencing versus what the user, the traveling public, the beneficiaries of the system are using, the vulnerability assessment and the risk assessment. And in terms of the relevance here to what appears in the TAM guide, we're really dialing in on the risk analysis and risk evaluation. Brad told you it's a complex issue. I'm hoping that you had your coffee and your bright eye, because this is going to get a little bit weird here. So step 1, that threat data collection. I'm showing you an example of what you see here is you see flood, rockfall, debris flow, all that post-fire debris flow. This is essentially how we organize what those threats are, as well as what are the data sources. So it's one thing to understand where your threats are. It's another thing to have an authoritative data source, and it's important to document it and have some consistency around that. And then below here, you saw that Brad showed within the TAM guide, there's a rough matrix that shows, lower threat, higher threat. Same thing here with the threat likelihood. We've quantified that a certain way. Again, details are in the guide. I'm going to move on to step 2, asset data collection. Now, beyond just basic condition of your asset, these are the types of things that we're looking at capturing information on the assets. Asset replacement costs. So I think it was either webinar 2 or webinar 3, we covered valuation, and we asked people, hey, do you have a practical usage for valuation? What do you use asset valuation? Well, here's an example of how you could actually use that asset valuation information. Asset replacement costs. Should an event occur, what is it going to cost you to replace it? Vulnerability. Now, vulnerability has sort of a special place in CDOT's heart. Typically, when we quantify risk, it's that likelihood times consequence. For us, it's likelihood times the vulnerability times consequence. Vulnerability are the things that you are actually managing, those risk management strategies that you have in place to make either your response or your asset more robust, things that you're doing, understanding that, yeah, events happen. These are the things that I put in place to harden my asset, but that doesn't necessarily take care of all threats. And then, of course, user consequences, and we're heavy on the user consequences, understanding that at the end of the day, it's kind of an oversimplification what I'm going to say here and purposely reductive. What you're quantifying is a very, it's not a precise or accurate, but a very robust benefit cost analysis. You're really looking at, if I do these things, here's how it affects vulnerability, here's how it affects user consequences. I'm going to move on to step number 3, how you calculate owner cost. And with this is, well, one, you talk to your asset managers, figure out, use your valuation, figure out how much it is when they do their treatments to repair damage it costs them to do it. Put that in the matrix, hold on to that data, but you apply the context of the threats to it. If there's a flood, here's how much it cost me to recover that asset or recover the level of surface functionality for it. Thank you, Maria. If there's a scour event, here's what it costs for me to manage it, so on and so forth. And then you do that by unit cost. Here, I'm showing this based upon pavement and bridge. How much does it cost per unit, square feet, square yards to do these things? And Maria, thank you for posting that. I was going to give credit at the end. We did this in association with AEM Core, so much props to them for developing this guide. Step number 4, here is the user consequences, a bunch of stuff on this one. We gained a lot of information from those earlier 2013 events that I mentioned. Also, we had a pilot on I-70 where we really advanced our knowledge on how to calculate these things, how to quantify things, what types of threats are we looking for, how do we classify them, as well as when it comes to quantifying, yeah, so the user feels pain, typically in a monetary sense, when we lose use of an asset. How do we go and collect that? And for us, one way to do it is based on days of closure. Based on days of closure, you could also look at vehicle occupancy, the cost of operating your vehicle, be it a car or truck, the cost of moving freight. That's all included in there, especially if it comes to things like I-70, which is that major east-west interstate that we have. Many of our detour routes were hours away. It could take you, instead of a quick 4-hour trip, all of a sudden you have a 10-hour trip to go across Colorado and get to your destination. So that's that detour table here. And then let me blow this up a little bit. What is a great presentation without a bunch of formulas in it? Here are the formulas. Don't spend too much time wincing at this. It's all included within the guide, as going through that step-by-step basis with plenty of examples of how you could apply this within your organization. Going to the vulnerability assessment, we have our definition of vulnerability. It's the measure of the asset's susceptibility to damage from a natural hazard. And this is sort of what's the worst thing that could happen and the probability of that worst thing that could happen. But looking at that in our vulnerability table, you could see that there's multiple lines of vulnerability. So we're not just looking at what's the worst thing that could happen. For this one, dealing with rockfall, we have 20 years. Yeah, have a big rockfall event. It's a 0.99%. Vulnerability is based off of a scale of close to 0 or close to 1, 1 being your highest. This would be the worst thing that could happen. But there's plenty of things in here where we can assess our vulnerability. Again, did we do anything about it? Are we maintaining the slope for this rockfall event in a certain way? That is applying risk management are good asset management practices to manage the vulnerability, increase the robustness of it. And we have basically a 0 to 1 quantification of how vulnerable is that asset in a table. So it's not just covering the best case or worst case, there's plenty in between. The last step here is, hey, look at that, more math. Risk assessment. Here's where we quantify our owner risk, our user risk, and then your total annual risk here. One thing I want to point out here is I mentioned our definition of risk is that calculation. It includes the consequence times likelihood, but it also includes that quantification of vulnerability. And then you put it all in here and you come up with your total annual risk calculation. So I want to point out, I don't really have a slide detailing this, but CDOT's risk register, if you reference the TAM, it all works in line with this approach. More specifically is the way we have the field set up is used to complement the math. That consequence, the likelihood, the vulnerability assessment within our risk register. But not just that, is FHWA requires that you look at reasonable alternative strategies. Now, with those reasonable alternative strategies, what you're really affecting here is that vulnerability score. If you put something reasonable in place to manage your risk, look at how that vulnerability score changes, and it will change your annual owner risk and then have a change to the corresponding total risk here. Just a quick snapshot of one of the tabs of the resilience tool that's included here. I would ask though that if you have any questions, the risk and resilience program is under me. I'm the performance and asset management branch manager for CDOT. Lizzie Kemp is on my team. Feel free to contact her. She's got plenty of information on this. Again, I posted the links to the website, and the links are here as well. And I'm going to stop sharing and pass it back to you, Brad.
Thanks, William. All right, Perry, if you can, I think, bring the main slides back up. All right, welcome back, everybody. I think everybody's coming back in. So hopefully everybody was able to do a rapid fire risk register. Got at least a few risks identified and evaluated. We worked through it on our team. I know we used some information from Arkansas DOT in the how-to guide, in the TAM guide. That was helpful. Do we want to just kind of walk around through the groups? I'm not entirely sure which group numbers, who is in each group number, but I'll just call out the numbers. So group 1.
Yeah, so that's the one I facilitated. And we mainly just talked that we had Colorado, Vermont, and Connecticut DOTs in our group, plus Bob Peskin, who works on transit asset management, and Maria Pena, who works on risks. She's from AEM. And so we talked about what experiences everyone had and came up with the 3 risks that you see on the screen, kind of maintaining the kind of the system of assets in a state of good repair. That came from Connecticut DOT. Lisa Conroy, who was in our group, is the asset steward for traffic signal assets. And so she raised that as the risk that's kind of, prominent in her mind. We talked about the aging workforce that I think Zoe Netherland from Vermont Agency of Transportation talked about that as a risk. And then Maria raised the issue of cyber events. So we didn't really get through the table, but we had a good discussion about, one issue was at this level of risk identification, is it practical to walk through a risk register? We felt like it was too high of a level. And I think Zoe was right in the middle of saying that they, had to break it down further in order to make it more of a manageable. Zoe, do you want to weigh in so you could finish the sentence you were in the middle of when we came back to the big group?
Sure. Thank you. Honestly, what I was saying was that it helped us to stop and think about what are the 6 big enterprise level risks, so that because there are so many demands and so many things going on at a time, it helped us to stop and look over everything, over the risk registers and the things that were going on, to focus in on at least 6 big themes, because we could break it down from there, but it helped to figure out where to focus. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Thanks, group 1. Group 2.
Hey Brad, that was my group, and thank you to my group. We got cut off right at the end before I could say that, but really appreciated everyone's involvement in our group. So we picked up 3 risks that we talked about here. I liked our group. We talked about turnover of senior staff and how that can be a political change of government type thing. I liked how we talked about that as both a threat and an opportunity. With changes at a senior level. So that was interesting. We talked about a number of things that were very, I think, current. So a lot of things that were related to COVID in terms of attrition, people leaving and retiring at this time, and those sort of things. Impact on cost of delivery and those sort of things. So I think as is generally the case with these, you think about stuff that you're dealing with now, and especially when you're in a hurried time like that. So yeah, so some good discussion. We talked about enterprise level risks and how the different levels were defined from figure 2.6. And yeah, and use the little hint you gave us earlier on, Brad, in terms of how we might classify these things as well.
Great, thanks. So I had a group 3, and thank you, as well, the group 3, everybody participated. And so we didn't spend a whole lot of time worrying about what risks to identify, because we wanted to dive in to give it an attempt, recognizing that at this level, we just kind of wanted to work our way through the prioritization process. So we used the example from the how-to, and we assigned some ratings, some numerical ratings to our risks of, we kept the funding uncertainty, we added in rock falls, unstable slopes, and hurricanes or major storms. And then we looked at those in terms of likelihood and impact. And what was interesting was things like rock falls and unstable slopes are fairly certain, but then their impact is major locally, but minor maybe statewide for any one. So that's where some of that difficulty of rating these things at this level came in. And we ended up prioritizing. So the rock falls and unstable slopes, due to their certainty, were kind of rated 1 and 1A. And then the hurricane ended up being our second, or I guess third then highest rated risk. And then that left funding uncertainty as the last. And we also talked about funding uncertainty being potentially an opportunity as well. And that there is that opportunity, particularly currently, that you could get more funding. So great. Thanks again to my group. And let's go to group 4.
Sure, I can go through this really quickly. We did something similar to you, Brad. We kind of just identified a few risks initially, and then went straight into classifying them in terms of likelihood and impact. We focused on that first one, funding uncertainty, but also just deterioration of assets, as well as cybersecurity. We had someone from Louisiana DOT that experienced immense hurricanes, and just kind of talking through how you assess risks there and plan for the impact and likelihood. So both we gave funding uncertainty and deterioration due to potential weather events, pretty high risk scores, and then cybersecurity was less than that. So our prioritization was reflected just funding uncertainty as the first one, but then that impacts the deterioration and then the cybersecurity after that.
Great, thanks. Good job, group 4. Group 5.
Hi, so I know we're almost out of time, but it's funny how we're coming up with some very similar types of risks. I mean, our group talked about funding and workforce issues and winter storms, and then just policy changes, what happens when your administration changes. It's sort of interesting to me how the difference in granularity of these different risks. Some you could really get your arms around and do something about, like trim the trees so that they don't fall on power lines, versus funding uncertainty, which is this huge, black hole. But anyways, it was a good discussion.
Thanks, group 5. And group 6.
Yeah, that was the group that came along with me on the ride. We actually did brainstorm a few different risk items. Some have had some pretty recent experience in working on updating their risk register. So we were able to get some good ideas from that work. The one thing we kind of spent some time talking about is just where in the guide, where could you find this information? So there's some discussion about that earlier in chapter 2. In particular, there's a kind of a how-to guide in chapter 2, but there's also information in section 541, as well as in in chapter 6 about sort of how to manage risks. And so we talked about where in the guide could we locate information if we were interested in this, and spent some time talking about that. Didn't get a lot of opportunity to really work through these specific risks, although we did kind of talk about this one on model prediction uncertainty, and that was where we kind of landed at or ran out of time, I guess I should say, at the end. So thanks to group 6, by the way. I appreciate everybody's contributions. It was great.
It seems like almost everyone had workforce and organization as a risk. So that's a good lead into next week's webinar, book club webinar, and it's going to be on increasing your workforce capacity and kind of looking at the organizational side. Back to you, Matt. I stole some of your thunder, Matt.
That's fine. So thanks to everyone for joining today, talking about risk. I think one of the risks is when people talk too long, and we don't have a way of, stopping them perhaps in a polite manner, so that we have more time for the collaboration. So I think for the next one, we'll make sure that we have a polite way of that hook to sort of drag them off, or the air horn to sort of indicate, okay, time's up. So we will look into that. But next week is workforce capacity. So again, please join us. Next Wednesday, we're going back to our Wednesday schedule from 2 to 3:30 p.m. Eastern Daylight Savings Time. And we promise to have more opportunity or more time allocated for the discussion, because I think that's where a lot of good information gets shared and that sort of thing. So with that, I want to thank the SpyPond team and everybody involved from the various companies for supporting this. I want to thank Steve Gay from FHWA, who can't be here, but for their support. And if you ever have any questions, comments, or concerns, please reach out to really any of the principals here. My email address is mhardy@ashto.org. Even if you're not from a state member, I'm happy to sort of point you in the right direction and get you connected with those that can help you out. So that's the name of the game, is helping out. Sharing is caring, right? Going back to kindergarten. All right. With that, thanks everybody. Have a great rest of the day. Stay safe and all that good stuff. And we'll see you in less than 1 week.